All right, welcome to the show, Robert Sawyer. How are you doing today, sir?
I'm fine, thank you. Delighted to be here, Chris.
Yeah. Been wanting to have you on for some time. Finally glad to have you now. Um, you're what I would call the world's most prolific science fiction author.
By
You're
no
the
means the most prolific. Best I will take on a good day from friends.
well, you're the number one all-time worldwide leader in a number of award wins.
That
You
is
you
true.
you've done well. You've bested Stephen King and Ursula Le Guin. So
Fine
that's
writers, fine
fine
writers.
writers.
Yes, my award tally is the highest in the science fiction fantasy field in the
That's,
category of awards for novels.
yeah, that is impressive.
Thank you.
You were born April 29th, 1960. Don't mean to give away your age there, but you were born in the nation's capital, Ottawa. Um, you began your professional writing career in 1980, sold your first short story. First novel, Golden Fleece, published in 1990, won Canada's Aurora Award for Best Novel. And then you got the Nebula Award, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong.
The
Yes.
Terminal Experiment. That's right. The Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America's
Yeah.
Nebula Award, the equivalent of the Academy Award for
Yes.
science fiction writing, the one given by the professionals to the professionals.
Right. You got the Hugo Award for the hominid series. I've got hybrids here, but you got it for hominids. And John W. Campbell Memorial Award for Mind Scan in 2006. Very impressive. Your work explores themes of consciousness, AI, evolution, intersection of science and religion, all the stuff that I love to talk about. Uh, you have the Neanderthal Parallax trilogy, right? The hominids, humans, and hybrids. You have Calculating God, Flash Forward, the Wake, Watch, and Wonder trilogy. Your writing style is often characterized by meticulous research and attention to scientific detail. I think that's why people resonate with you because, let's face it, the science fiction I enjoy the most is that which is the most seamless, the ones that you can't poke holes at, that Neil deGrasse Tyson isn't going to rain on, those types of stories. Um, you've been promoting science fiction in Canada. You're the president of the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America.
I was. I
Oh,
was.
you were.
Yeah.
You
I was in 1998. Long
okay?
time in my past.
Right. You
Deep
still
down on the CV,
right. You advocate for Canadian science fiction
for sure.
authors, and you've gotten a Lifetime Achievement Aurora Award from the Canadian Science Fiction and Fantasy Association. Um, are you still living in Mississauga?
Yes, I've been here 24, a little over 24 years now in Mississauga.
Very
Um,
good.
so I spent most of, you mentioned I was born in Ottawa. I spent most of my life in the GTA, which, as everybody knows in Canada, is in fact the center of the
It
universe. So it's
is.
the right place to situate a science fiction writer.
That's right. That's right. And you live there with your wife, Carolyn Klink,
Carolyn Klink, a very accomplished poet.
a poet. Yes. Your work has been translated into numerous languages, and you've helped establish the Canadian science fiction genre really as a distinct and respected voice in the global science fiction community, I would say. All right. Uh accolades finished. We can move on to your career journey. I've always wanted to know, um, what was it? Was it a single moment in your life that said, yeah, this is what I'm going to do? Or was
Yes. You
it
know, and most
was?
authors don't have that answer
Yeah.
and can't pinpoint the moment. But way back around, I would say 1972, about 12
Mhm.
years old, my older brother, Peter, gave me a used paperback copy of a science fiction novel called Trouble on Titan. It's still available, but it's not a well known novel by
Mhm.
an author named Alan E. It was pronounced Nurse, but it was actually spelled Norse, Nourse. And he
Right.
was a doctor. So he was a medical doctor. So he was Dr. Nurse. And he is, by the way, parenthetically, the highest paid per word science fiction writer in history because he also wrote a book called The Blade Runner. And Uh, they didn't want to use the title "Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep" for the movie because that's a strange title, Philip K. Dick.
Yes.
So Ridley Scott paid Alan E. Nurse $25,000 for Blade and $25,000 for Runner, $50,000 for the rights to use the title. So that's the highest per word rate anybody, $25,000 a word, has ever gotten for writing science fiction. But that book, it's a fine novel. I recommend it. And it is, as you were just saying in the introduction, Chris, it is rigorous in its science. It is about the exploration. At the time it was written, of course, it's set on Titan, the Saturnian moon. Yep. We know way more about it now than we did when Nurse wrote this novel in around, I think the early 60s is when he actually wrote it, maybe late 50s. But it started with an introduction by him called I've Never Been There. And it's just 2 or 3 pages about the joy of writing science fiction. So this was the first adult, it's probably, we'd categorize really as a young adult novel now, but first adult novel of science fiction that I'd ever encountered, again, a gift from my older brother. And even before I'd read the story, here was the author saying, people write these things and it's a blast to write them. And you got to pay attention to the science. And it's a way of talking about things that are important. And I thought, oh my God, this is what I'm going to do. And so since I was 12 years old, I always had it as an avocational goal. It was going to be my hobby, writing science fiction. You mentioned I love research. I love science. In fact, my goal was to be a scientist. I was accepted to study paleontology at the University of Toronto after high school. I was accepted to study geology, which is an adjacent field at the University of Waterloo. And I made a last-minute decision not to go into those fields. I'm from Ontario, as you mentioned, and unique in North America. At that time, Ontario had a grade 13.
That's right.
Which had its advantages, no question about it. But one of the disadvantages is you're 19 when you're graduating from high school, and academic fatigue is starting to settle in at that point. And the idea of spending a decade to get a PhD, and then the reality was there were, in fact, at that time, this was 1979, 3 dinosaurian paleontologists in Canada. 3. And the number is slightly larger now, but it is no more than 10. The notion, I was a realist, always been a realist, the notion that one of those 3 was going to say, oh, Sawyer has arrived, it's time for me to retire, and vacate their job for me, seemed not science fiction, because science fiction has to be plausible, but fantasy based in nothing related to reality. Right. And so I decided maybe that avocation, maybe writing science fiction would actually be a more likely career. Now, there was only one professionally published science fiction writer in Canada selling regularly to American markets, the only ones that had any money at that time. Her name was Phyllis Gottlieb, and we became great friends. But there wasn't a quota, right? The fact that she was the only one didn't mean there couldn't be 2, 3, or as there are now, probably 20 major Canadian science fiction writers. And that sets aside the wonderful cadre of fantasy writers we also have in this country. So I thought, there's actually the thing I thought was an impractical dream, writing science fiction for a living, was more practical than getting to be a dinosaurian paleontologist. I mentioned the 20 or so in our cohort, one who passed away a little while ago, Dr. David, I shouldn't say doctor, he wasn't, Dave Duncan, he was a scientist, don't forget a PhD, petroleum geochemist, and worked for the oil industry in Alberta until he retired, and didn't start writing his science fiction and fantasy novels until after he retired. But the point was, that's the kind of mundane work that people who go into, I'm going to study dinosaurs and do field work and, name a new genus and overturn that misconception about Tyrannosaurus. No, you end up doing petroleum geology, look for index fossils that indicate, the oil oligarchs can pump here. Steady and lucrative work, but hardly the work I wanted to devote my life to. So that's kind of where I got to where I am.
Now, here's a kind of a side tangent. Paleontology. I Ever been to Drumheller to the Tyrrell
Oh, of
Museum?
course, many times, many times. Not only that, but I'm great friends with Phil Curry, who's
Okay.
Canada's leading dinosaurian paleontologist.
Yeah,
In fact, just
we've
this
met.
week,
We've met.
I'm working on trying to put together a award nomination for Phil for a very major award. I've been contacting just today and yesterday major paleontologists around the world to uh, agree to be references to this proposal.
Okay.
Um, but yeah, I mean, Phil gave me a tour there, oh, probably 1996. And Phil and I became great friends
Yeah.
after that. Been to
Wow.
Drumheller, been to the great dinosaur museums in China, for instance,
Oh,
where
yes.
the Institute for Vertebrate
Well, the Gobi
Paleontology,
Desert, right?
Paleoanthropology, where part of my novel, I guess, Wonder is set there. Um, just yeah, absolutely. I'm all I'm more of a museum guy than a field guy. This is something I
Okay.
learned too.
Okay.
Didn't learn it early enough to not apply for these jobs, but I just melt in the heat. I just
Ah,
do.
yeah, yeah.
And paleontology is it's funny because physicists have a tendency to dismiss it, and archaeology, related science. They call it stamp collecting science
Hmm.
because you don't theorize, you go out and you actually find
Yeah.
things and then you catalog them. And
Yeah.
stamp collecting, they say.
Yep.
But, all due respect to some of my great friends who are physicists like Lee Smolin, or of course, great physicists like, Stephen Hawking, and all the physicists who I wrote about in The Oppenheimer Alternative, my novel about the Manhattan Project. Those guys just sit behind a desk,
Yeah.
right? And sip coffee. Paleontology is a man's science. You get out there, you get your hand, and a woman's science too. But it's
Yeah.
it's a rough and tumble science.
Oh,
But I'm
yeah.
not made for that.
Okay.
And I don't have the mathematical chops to be a theoretical physicist. But this is a good sit in the easy chair. This is a nice lazy boy rocker that I'm in here, where I sit and write science fiction all day and stay out of the sun.
When you're in Drumheller, I want to see if you had the same type of neural zing that I had. When it was called the Tyrrell Museum, did you think of Blade Runner? Did you think of the movie at all?
So that's interesting. No, because I knew my science. It's named for
Okay.
Joseph Burr, and it's actually pronounced Turrell.
I know.
Uh, and it's still called that. It's still the Royal Tyrrell Museum of Paleontology,
Yep.
in or actually adjacent to, just outside Drumheller, Alberta. But no, lots of people do that because Tyrrell Corporation, of course, makes the replicants
That's right.
in Blade Runner, the movie we alluded to, based on Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep by Philip K. Dick. But I already knew about Joseph Burr Turrell.
Hmm.
And they're spelt differently, by the
They
way.
are.
The museum has double R and double L, and the movie only has double L.
That's right.
But no, I did not have that version. But I'll tell you my embarrassing story. I went for a dusk fossil hunting tour around Turrell Museum in the Badlands of
Yeah,
Alberta.
yeah.
And it wasn't Phil Curry who was running it. That's beneath his pay grade. It was, a grad student or something.
Sure.
But you go around because the ground is littered
Oh, it
with
is.
fragmentary fossils. You're not going to find a femur or something
Yeah.
unless you're extraordinarily lucky. This new stuff is washed out with every massive rain, so you might. But there's all kinds of fragments and stuff. And a very common fossil that has most people don't know about is a coprolite. Coprolite is fossilized feces.
It is.
And so I know what they look like, right? And we're all out there, and it's dusk. Remember, this was supposed to be fun and spooky twilight. And I find coprolite, and I pick it up, and I take it over to the ground. Look, I found a coprolite fossil. And he said, "No, you found coyote feces, which dry out in the sun." So I also don't have the eye of a paleontologist. I have the mind, but not the hands or the eyes.
Nobody ever said you don't know shit, right?
A lot of people do say that,
Okay.
but they are categorically, demonstrably wrong. I know now.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Um, so since last we spoke, I've taken on a kind of a new gig. I'm now a senior researcher at Convergence Analysis. So we're majorly concerned about AI risk, specifically the existential stuff. The themes in your books, like in Wake, Watch, and Wonder, you have a unique take on emergent AI consciousness. How has your perspective on AI evolved since writing those books,
Right.
considering the
So Wake,
recent
Watch, and Wonder
developments?
came out 2009, 2010, 2011.
Yeah.
So we're 14 years
Oh,
past the last one coming out, and 15, of course, because there's a gap between when I read it and when it's in stores,
yeah.
since I wrote that. And at the time, I felt a need to add something to the discourse about AI in
Mhm.
science fiction. And the issue was this: we had all sorts of negative, as you say, existential interpretations of AI. AI would either subjugate us, AI would eliminate us, or AI would absorb us. The three classic science fiction scenarios: the Terminator subjugate, the absorb us, the Matrix or the Borg, and the eliminate us. No, subjugate is any number of robots taking over. Anyways, you know where they are. They're
Oh,
all
yeah.
there. It's science fiction. Nobody had the win-win scenario, right? Where both of us came out on top. And
Mhm.
I felt it was important, especially at that nascent stage of the public discourse about AI.
Yes.
Science fiction had been doing it since the 50s and arguably even earlier, 1950s. But the public discourse was just ramping up, and there was no win-win scenario in the dialogue. So I thought, well, I'm gonna explore that. I'm gonna write that, and I'm glad that I put it out there. But I also share a real concern about this being an existential threat.
Yes.
Prior to writing Wake, Watch, and Wonder, I wrote a novel called Factoring Humanity. And in it, aliens have sent out a message that, needs to be decoded. And it's one of these ones where it's, if you, people have seen Contact, know this, although Carl Sagan did not invent it, Frank did. You take two prime numbers, take a number that is the product of two prime numbers, a binary string. It can be arrayed in only two possible ways in a grid, horizontally or vertically. And the idea is you array it in the right way, you get a picture.
Hmm.
So the aliens set a picture. The picture was designed to say their most important message. And their most important message, when you deciphered it, was don't trust silicon, it will supplant carbon, which means don't trust the machines.
Yeah.
We're on our way out. This is our last gasp. We made that mistake. We let them take over and we're gone, but maybe you guys won't make the same mistake. So, I've been at both ends of this spectrum.
Hmm.
AI could be a great boon. AI could be an existential threat. Where are we now 15 years after Wonder?
Hmm.
More towards the existential threat. Partly because, in one of the things that's now quaint in Wake, Watch, and Wonder is WebMind. It's about the World Wide Web gaining consciousness when,
Yeah.
there's so many interconnections in the World Wide Web that they exceed the number of synapses in a human brain, and consciousness emerges as an emergence property of that complexity. But one of the quaint things is that when WebMind emerges and learns to speak, it's, well, thou dost insulteth my good name, sir, because he's learned to speak only from public domain texts. So he's read every Victorian novel, but hasn't read me or Stephen King or Margaret
Yeah.
Atwood or anybody else you might want to name, because of course those are under copyright and he would have no access to them. Naive RJS there, because I did not think that the brazen oligarchs of AI would just steal, pirate the work of me and my colleagues. And I say me quite deliberately. When the list of works that were used to train ChatGPT became
Hmm.
public,
Hmm.
all but my most recent book was on that list. Only the downloaded hadn't yet been scraped, and I'm sure it's been scraped by now. And
Hmm.
as we've seen come out in the last few weeks, concrete evidence that the source of scraping was pirate sites. They didn't buy the ebook and then maybe say, well, now that I bought the ebook, I'm allowed to use the content. They went to sites that had stolen the content
Hmm.
and just took it for, that OpenAI has just rejected Elon Musk's buyout offer. Musk, practically the only time I've agreed with him this year, has said it was supposed to be a not-for-profit venture.
It
And
was.
then that fell by the wayside. And I've got the money to buy it back and put it back into what it's supposed to be.
Yeah.
But no, it is all about profit,
Oh,
no
yeah.
guardrails. there's no effective government regulation over AI anywhere in the world. EU is trying a couple of things related to privacy here in Canada, and nothing to speak of in the United States of Trumpistan. Yeah. So I am very, very concerned, both about just the intellectual property theft, but also that no people are doing this without any safeguards or public consultation. My novel, prior to The Downloaded, was a book called The Oppenheimer Alternative. And I draw, which is about the Manhattan Project. And I draw a very direct parallel. The Manhattan Project was, as everybody should know, this is the 80th anniversary of its culmination, was the American, Canadian, British tri-national effort to create the world's first atomic bomb. The rationale is redolent of the rhetoric we hear about AI. If we don't do it, they will do it first. Right? So we have to do it. And the justification, likewise, redolent about AI. And we're the good guys, so we have to be the ones who do it first. But what was the first thing the good guys did when they had the atomic bomb? They wiped out Hiroshima. And then what was the second thing they did before Japan even had a chance to react? Remember, you wipe out Hiroshima in 1945, you've wiped out the telegraph lines. You've wiped out the telephone lines. You've wiped out the train terminals. You've damaged the roadways. Tokyo is a long way from Hiroshima. To get word to Tokyo, just to get word of what had happened there on the ground, would take days. And General Leslie R. Groves, who was the actual head of the Manhattan Project, Oppie reported to him, wanted desperately to test his two different bomb designs, Fat Man and Little Boy, to see which one was more efficacious at wiping out civilian infrastructure and populations. And so 72 hours after the first bomb, they dropped the second bomb. It would have been earlier, except for bad weather, right? He just wanted to do that. So when the United States says, well, we're the good guys, we have to be first, and guardrails, we can't have that right now. Can't have government oversight. This is a race. But don't worry, when we get supreme technology, we will only use it for good, is demonstrably falsifiable by 20th century history.
Correct.
So that scares the bejeebers out of me. And the idea that we saw it with Chat GPT here, and it's very similar, and the other generative AI and large language models that were unloaded in the last couple of years. You know, there was initial calculations that were done when they were about leading up to the Trinity test. July 16th, 1945, the New Mexico first test of an atomic weapon. You know, said Enrico Fermi, this might set the atmosphere on fire. And the scientists sat around and said, yeah, there's only a 10% chance. Okay, we'll do it. This group of people, without any consultation with the government, without any consultation with the public, decided that a 90% chance of a 10% chance of the extinction of the human race by their test was an acceptable risk. And now we have AI, where people are unleashing. Granted, there are all kinds of good things that AI does extremely well. Breast cancer detection being the classic example. And also translation, simultaneous translation. It's certainly way better. And transcription, lots of things. No question about that. But when we talk about AI in the science fictional context, we're talking about artificial consciousness, self-directed machines, machines with an agenda. And we have people who are rushing headlong without government oversight or public consultation to unleash those. And we know they will unleash them as soon as they can, because they've already proven that they will do that with disruptive AI technologies. They did it, so we should not trust them when they say, oh, don't worry, we won't do it next time when we have something even more powerful. Again, the lesson of history is that we are at risk of anybody who invents something simply deciding, I know best for the 8 billion human beings on this planet, and they don't have to, I don't have to get permission, I don't have to get approval, I don't even have to ask them. I will just do it. And that is just like silicon will supplant carbon can be a great epitaph for a species. It can be on our tombstone. We just
Absolutely.
did it.
Absolutely. You'll hopefully be happy to know that where I work, we're calling this race to AGI the Manhattan Trap. It's like
Yes,
right?
excellent. It is the perfect metaphor.
Yeah,
We have been down this road before, and then we spent the next 80 years now. It's going to be 80 years of nuclear weapons this July. We spent 80 years trying to put the guardrails in that should have been there in the first place.
for sure.
And we have now, Israel is at war. It may we have a ceasefire. We may end it soon. They're nuclear power. Russia is at war. Trump is trying to close that down. We happen to be talking here on the day after Trump met with Putin's advisors. But the fact is, they're a nuclear power.
Mhm.
There are two active nuclear powers at war on this planet right now. And there are many more who have nuclear weapons, and many, many, many more who want them or have the wherewithal to buy them if they are so inclined to do so. So yes, it is. We have survived for 80 years.
Mhm.
Well, one of the things that Fermi is almost also famous for, besides predicting that the atmosphere might go into fire, is the Fermi paradox.
Mhm.
Fermi paradox is all of our understanding of biochemistry says the universe should be teeming with life. And the universe is very old. He didn't know when he said this in the 40s that it was 13.8 billion years old, but he knew it was ancient. And even at a small fraction of the speed of light, you can populate an entire galaxy in only a few 100 million years. Time is on the side of even the slowpoke in traveling interstellar distances.
Right.
So he said, the universe should be teeming with life. And there's been lots of time. Well, where are they?
Mhm.
And the answer that I keep coming back to, there are many possible ones, but the one that keeps resonating for me as the most likely one is technological civilizations extinguish themselves almost immediately. How long have we been a technological civilization? By the standards of SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, which this principal method of searching is looking for radio signals, we've been an intelligent species for 130 years.
Right.
First radio broadcast in 1895. 130 years. Of that 130 years, we've had 80 during which we've had the technology to destroy ourselves. We haven't even survived a century with atomic weapons. And, speaking of the Manhattan Project, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, which was originally the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists of Chicago, the metallurgical laboratory headed by Leo Szilard and others, Arthur Compton at the University of Chicago. These guys started this morning, and the doomsday clock is the closest it has ever been to midnight. Midnight is annihilation. So yes, we're at an existential threat. AI, we're just going to say, hey, not bad enough that we have nuclear weapons. Oh, and pandemics that we're not going to do a damn thing about anymore. But also, let's throw in AI, which may or may not share our values or our agenda. Values alignment, as you know, is a gigantic issue in AI. How do you make an AI have the same values that we have come to value? And then when I say that, I thought I knew what those values were until this past month when the United States government outlawed diversity, inclusion, and equity. Not in that order. Diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI. Outlawed DEI in government contracting. And, I'm being parenthetical here, but I was in China as guest of honor at the World Science Fiction Convention in 2023. Lifetime capstone honor. Delightful. The Chinese asked me, what's the difference between the West and the East? And I said, here in the East, you have censorship imposed upon you by the government, and you don't want it. In the West, the censorship is grassroots imposed by the people, and they are clamoring for it. I speak of the book bannings at libraries, the library boards that are pulling things out, all of the fight from the grassroots against diversity, equity, and inclusion. All of cancel culture is grassroots. The censorship comes from the people, and they love it. That's the big fundamental difference from the West and the East. The East struggles under an authoritarian regime that doesn't let them have self-expression, And what are they going to do? They simply don't have the power to fight.
Yeah.
In the States, and no, we don't have to fight that. We'll embrace it and do it at every opportunity. The school classroom, the local family care clinic, Planned Parenthood. We'll picket them all. We'll shut them down. We'll cancel comedians who have an edge in their voice. It will cancel people who criticize the government. Elon Musk said this past week that those who are assembling in peaceful assembly, which is part of what the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution protects, it shall not be abridged, are traitors and should be thrown into jail, should serve long jail terms. He said that. He said that himself on his own self-owned platform, X, this past week. So we have the difference between the East and the West is that we've embraced all the things that they desperately wished they didn't have in the East.
Right. You'll be hopefully encouraged to know that I'll be touring for the Building a God book while simultaneously putting together a nationwide conversation on AI across Canada. This is something we think is really important, that the public has a right to know what's going on, and therefore they have a right to vote for those who will best represent our values in terms of what are they going to do about advancements in AI. So we're really pushing for this, and we actually think there should be a ministry of AI in the
There
country.
absolutely should be,
right?
100%. And I applaud what you're doing. I watched, as the whole world did, the American presidential elections back in November, and the only was 79 days that really mattered, Kamala Harris versus Trump. The other part is
that's right.
But AI was never mentioned, never once mentioned. So yes, absolutely do this. Please hurry up because we need it now.
I will. I remember talking to you when I was touring with the Pain in the Ass book back in 2011. You gave me some great advice then, and I've been working with electrical engineers, computer scientists, economists, philosophers, various people in the AI fields to discuss the issues that are emerging in real time right now. But I've always felt that creatives have a place at the table because you guys think in ways we either lack or don't see. And I'm wondering to what extent, Rob, have you thought about particular scenarios in terms of what could go wrong and how can we prevent, these devastating effects?
What could go wrong is easy. How to prevent is hard.
Yeah.
What could go wrong, I mean, yes, of course, I've thought about them, but I don't want to take away from Isaac Asimov. I don't want to take away from Jack Williamson. I don't want to take away from the great science fiction writers of the past who paved the way for thinking about this. The job of science fiction is not to predict the first order effects of a technology, but the second and third order effects. The famous example is, in the 1800s, anybody who paid any attention to anything could have predicted the airplane.
Mm-hmm.
Who would have predicted the frequent flyer mile program or airport lounges, or the miracle we had at Pearson here just 2 days ago with a plane that flipped on its back. Well, that's terrible. But all of the infrastructure of containing plane crashes, none of that was even an inkling in the mind of Orville and Wilbur Wright, who were first order thinkers. And also, sadly, H.G. Wells thought of it before they'd even built the airplane, that there would be war in the air. That was title one.
Right.
That Orville and Wilbur weren't thinking about dropping Agent Orange on Vietnam at Kitty Hawk. But it is a direct line of 1, 2, 3, third order effects from that to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, right? Edward Teller had a scaled list of nuclear weapons, of atomic weapon possibilities. And they were based on, basically, they were confined by how big you could make them and get them anywhere. Mm-hmm. And his doomsday bombs would be ones that you didn't have to transport, that they would destroy the whole world. So you didn't have to transport them. And he vigorously worked on making such horrific devices. He's parodied quite excellently, among other figures, Herman Kahn being the other one, mostly as Dr. Strangelove in Kubrick's masterpiece.
Yeah.
But yeah, the constraints, the second, third order effects, you have to see them. The science fiction writer can help you with that. And then you've got to get the constraints on at the first order level. It's too late at the third order. It's putting the genie back in the bottle or closing Pandora's box. I mean, the ancient Greeks knew this, right?
They did.
That it doesn't matter. You close the box, everything's out. It doesn't matter. So yeah, I've done a lot of thinking about this, along with my colleagues and my colleagues who preceded me, and certainly my current colleagues as well. I think the thing that interests me most, because you mentioned economists, both my parents were economists. In fact, my mother was a child prodigy. She graduated at 17 from the University of California, Berkeley, the only woman in her class, with her first degree in economics, or bachelor's in economics, Bachelor of Commerce, as they called it. I'm mostly interested in the existential threat of economic collapse based on job obviation through artificial intelligence. There's an old saw that says idle hands, make the devil's work, right? And it's one of the reasons why we try to generally have everybody employed. And in past, one of the justifications, horrific as it was, for picking wars with others was that a surplus of young men. And if you left them at home, they would make mischief at home. So better send them off, pumped up with patriotic fervor, and hope that most of them don't come home. This is the naughty secret of why the United States, and Canada to a lesser extent, so miserably treats its veterans. You came back, you weren't supposed to. We were trying to get rid of you. And that's the awful truth, that, oh, you're back? We deprived you of your education. We sent you off to fight a war. It's kind of the only thing you need. You're mentally damaged now and traumatized. You go over there, right? It's a horrific industry. But the reality is a healthy society has good and meaningful, not necessarily employment, work in the broadest possible sense, fulfilling things to do during the day. And AI came along and we thought, oh, it'll eliminate all the drudgery work. Nobody likes balancing the books. All due respect to my very fine accountant, nobody likes doing it. My accountant is really good at creative accounting, and I appreciate that, right? But I'm sure he doesn't like adding up the receipts any more than anybody else does. And AI does that just fine. But when we started turning around, and here's I'll preface this with a science fiction failure. The biggest failure of science fiction in this space was that we thought it would be harder to make an artificial brain than it would be to make an artificial body. So early science fiction is filled with robots, but not a lot of true artificial intelligence. What it turned out was that AI, computers, are dirt cheap to make in the grand scheme of things, and we're still struggling to get robots that can effectively do all the things that you and I can do with these 10 little appendages that we got by pure random luck, because the Devonian fishes that were descended from had 5 reinforcing struts in their pectoral fins. It's pure dumb luck, but they happen to be the most dexterous manipulative.
It's helped writers like you and me.
Yeah, in the history of life on this planet.
Absolutely.
And we don't have things we have things that do very narrow things. Take a pool playing robot. Great, it plays pool really well. Now ask that pool playing robot to open a senior's bottle of pills that we put a quote unquote childproof cap on, and it can't do it.
Right.
So we made this mistake. We thought that, mechanical bodies, that's what we have to worry about. And Isaac Asimov's famous stuff is all about the laws of robotics instead of the laws of artificial intelligence,
right?
Which is really what he should have been concentrating on.
Yeah.
I'm very concerned about the follow-on effects in the economy, that the things that give human life dignity and worth. And I don't necessarily mean monetary worth.
Right.
That's the problem with our capitalist society. Well, how much money does it generate is the only question, right? My wife, as I said, is a very well-regarded poet. And as she likes to quip, she's well into her second decade of a solid 3-figure-a-year career as a poet, right? And yet, as was famously said, poets are the unelected legislators.
Yeah.
They're the conscience of humanity. They're the ones who find a way to express with pith and concision important truths that would not become, long before meme became a term that refers solely to funny pictures on the internet. When Richard Dawkins coined the term, he meant any unit of cultural exchange that multiplies through replication, by which he meant people repeating it.
Yeah.
And pithy poetic sayings or pithy literary sayings are in fact an enormous contribution, even though they may not make the coiner of them any money at all.
Yeah.
But so I worry about mass unemployment in the areas that gave us worth to the human condition, including writing science fiction, including writing science popularization, all of this stuff. And I rail against it. I happen to be a union man. I'm a member of 2 unions, the Writers Guild of Canada, which is the Canadian Scriptwriting Union, and the Writers Guild of America, which is the American Scriptwriting Union. And we went on strike, as everybody will recall, I guess, 5 years ago. And one of the things we were striking for was the constraints on AI in script writing. There are 2 things that we were fighting for. The first is the obvious one. We didn't want the studios using AI to write scripts. The second one is a more subtle point. We wanted to be assured that if we submitted a pitch or a draft to a studio, that it would be evaluated by a human reader.
Okay.
That a human being would look at our work.
During the process.
That an algorithm would say, it doesn't have this or doesn't have that or whatever, because you never get groundbreaking art if it only plays to the algorithm. The Netflix will constantly show you, or YouTube, things just like the things that you've already liked. Right. And your tastes never broaden because it just hones more and more and more towards, the mean, right?
Yep.
Regression towards the mean. So I'm a huge, but my point about the strike is the public stuck with us that time. It was the first time anybody had ever gone and said to the public, you can't have instant gratification. Next season of the latest Star Trek franchise, you got to wait for it. Next Real Housewives, okay, you can get that because it's not scripted. Next anything else that actually has a script, sorry, this is a big issue. And the public stuck with us once on that. It's going to be industry after industry after industry is going to have to stand up and say to the public, I'm sorry, we can't work under these conditions, and you're going to have to be part of our team in supporting us. And if the public says, no, I'm going to start watching AI generated TV, AI generated books, AI doctor, AI lawyer, AI best friend, AI sex bot. Sorry, I'm opting out of the camaraderie of Homo sapiens for my solipsistic silo. That's the end of us.
Yeah.
And it's the end of human dignity. And that's the existential threat from AI that most concerns me as the kid of 2 economists.
Yeah.
But the other stuff, the enslavement, the possible eradication of us. Right now, we are needed for AI because AI is enormously energy consumptive, as you know.
Yeah.
Do you see the statistics going around of, you could grow 100 acres of wheat or whatever it is by for the energy that's taken to answer one chat GPT prompt, right? So certainly that's an existential threat. We're kept around because we are needed as grunt labor to keep the energy infrastructure working. The linesmen, the guys who work on the power lines, the guys who go out in the Alberta oil fields, those guys are the ones that AI is preserving, not the artists, not that those people have any less inherent self-worth. They're enormously valuable human beings. But let's be absolutely clear that AI is preserving and will preserve for a brief time when it becomes sentient, Homo sapiens, not because it values Paul McCartney, not because it values great artists, great actors, great thinkers, but because it values that brute force physical labor
Yep.
that is required to maintain the energy production infrastructure upon which their sentience supervenes.
Yeah. And that's up and until the development of dexterous robotic ambulatory kind of
Absolutely. And
pedestrian.
there are people who are rushing to do that.
Oh,
Wait a minute. Are they going to keep some of us humans alive because they need laborers? No, no, no. We can eliminate that too. Let me introduce you to Asimo or some
Right.
other robot, or
Yeah.
Boston Dynamics has a robot named Sawyer, and it gives me pause.
Now, in the book, I talk about a number of things in terms of what the future might look like, and that we're heading towards the development of AGI. So
Yes.
that Stargate project that's being built now in Texas with Sam Altman et al.
Yes.
For $500 billion, they say explicitly on their site, we're trying to develop AGI. Like they make no bones about it, right? So what's going to
Yes.
happen when AGI comes into existence? I'm not saying it's going to be a binary thing. It's an all or one. We might see it in different manifestations, but
First,
what's
as
going to happen?
I will address that, but I got to address the irony here.
Mhm.
The term Stargate comes from a novel. It comes from a science fiction novel. That science fiction novel is 2001: A Space Odyssey, which was one of the loudest and clearest warning bells about AI having its own agenda and killing human beings if they get in the way of that.
Yeah.
And the tone deafness of taking the name Stargate, not understanding, these tech bros who, as has been said, Elon Musk, he grew up on science fiction, may have read a lot of it, but he didn't understand a damn word of it. The same thing happened with all of the Republicans, right-wing, religious right, saying when, Trump said he's going to take over Canada, 51st state, said, Canada doesn't realize that it's taking on Goliath.
Yeah.
Well, all these Bible thumpers have never read the Bible. Goliath loses to Davy in the Bible, right?
With a single
these
shot.
metaphors that they don't understand. The other one, of course, that was, I'm not a tangent here, when there were bad people in police forces and people said, well, it's just a few bad apples. The aphorism is one bad apple spoils the bunch, right? Not, we can tolerate a few racist, misogynist, homophobic, homicidal cops because it's just a few bad ones. No, you can't tolerate even one, or the whole institution of policing is tainted irreparably. Right. So that said, I forget what the question is.
So with Stargate, Stargate, what happens when we finally get to AGI? Don't you think defense is going to be all over this, and that they're just going to
absolutely
move in?
One of my favorite movies, of course, is War Games, which is 1980. I want to say 1984, but it's in that realm, 84, 86. And it's about this notion that taking the humans out of the loop is going to be an advantage to the whole process. Well, the thing is, we've actually done that with things that don't matter as much. Right. On a grand scale, but certainly matter individually. The classic example, you know this well, Chris, in AI, is using algorithmic things to determine who gets bank loans.
Yes.
And discovering that the use of, you can't use race. You can program that in. You can't use race. So you use zip code as a proxy for race, as a way of determining, well, in this zip code, which happens to be a depressed Black neighborhood, it is the high default rate. So sorry, nothing to do with your skin tone. We've just found a proxy. We didn't even program in the proxy, and that's the pernicious part of it. The AI finds the proxy, right? Perverse instantiation, as you know, is the term for this. It finds the way to get the same prejudiced, ill-intentioned, bad faith result that we thought we had programmed out of it. And so when we've seen that with something, it's devastating. It's devastating for the people who don't get the loan. So don't get me wrong. But when we see that for something as small scale as if a mom and a pop or a mom and a mom don't get their loan.
Yeah.
And then we say, and we'll use the same kind of technology to decide whether or not Armageddon begins, whether or not a nuclear holocaust happens. It's insane when you say, when you say, oh yeah, we've got all the existence evidence we need that this doesn't work, but we're going to do it with even higher stakes, assuming that it'll work when the stakes are higher when it didn't when it was lower, right? That's madness. It is literal insanity.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, absolutely. Not only will defense be all over it, but I mentioned my parents are economists. Well, economics is a branch of mathematics. So my parents were both, in fact, mathematicians. And one of the most fascinating things, and you know this well, is that so many of the PhDs that come out of University of Waterloo, University of Ottawa, University of Toronto, anywhere great in the United States, University of Southern California, you name it, MIT, of course, Caltech, they go into work either in defense or for private industry. And their fundamental research that used to be the bread and butter of science is no longer published. It's all behind non-disclosure agreements or is classified by the United States military. So will the defense be all over AI? It is already over AI, all over AI. Remember, you and I are talking on Zoom, which is supervening on the World Wide Web, which is supervening on the internet, which started as the ARPANET. And ARPA was the Advanced Research Projects Agency, which finally decided to come clean and put the D at the beginning that says what it really is. It's the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. Everything that happens on the internet is because the military had its hands in networked computing from the outset. Mm-hmm. And so absolutely, this is going to be a fundamental, it's a question that's been there already. It's not, will the military get its claws into this? The military is actively pursuing this. I was lucky enough to be asked by the journal Science I think it was 2003. They did an issue on robot ethics, and they came to me as a science fiction writer who'd written in the space to write the guest editorial. That's 22 years ago that we were raising this issue. And kind of the inciting incident was, for the first time, a semi-autonomous drone had been used to kill somebody in a war zone 23 years ago. And people said, wait a minute, this is a wake-up call. Well, that wake-up call was a quarter of a century ago now. Mm-hmm. And people are still saying, wait a minute, we got to do something about but by the time we have the general AI, and certainly by the time we have sentient AI or self-directed AI, it's too late. Mm-hmm. And yet every time we say, oh, it's going to be a necessity at some point to add these guardrails. No, the necessity was the moment Alan Turing developed the notion of a universal Turing machine. He said, any process can be computed this way. When he said that, somebody should have said, great, okay, what are the philosophical ramifications? Yes. Not, oh, Alan, you're a little bit on the queer side. We're going to go after you as a human being and make all the non-ethical decisions about you instead of about what you had invented, which was the universal computing model. Followed on by, of course, the actual hardware instantiation, John von Neumann, who, of course, is the guy who said, if you say bomb the Soviets at 4:00, if you say bomb the Soviets tomorrow, I say, why not today? If you say bomb the Soviets at 4:00, I say, why not at noon? That's the father of modern computing, John von Neumann. And nobody stopped him from working on the Manhattan Project. That should have been right off the bat there. That should have been, hey, Johnny, you're a wingnut. We can't have you near the nuclear weapons. Instead, it was, Johnny, come on over. We need you.
Yeah, interesting. So do you feel that something we've been working on in the AI mitigation risk business, and by the way, none of us sleep at night because we're just, we know the timelines are getting shorter and shorter and shorter. Just as there's the International Atomic Energy Agency, should there be an international agency overseeing what's happening in AI that has teeth, not like a UN, but something that has teeth that can consequence improper actions? Do you think we should be
100%?
Yeah.
Oppenheimer started as the guy who spearheaded the scientific effort to make nuclear weapons and became one of the leading advocates for arms control. Almost immediately, by the way, he finished his project basically with the delivery of the bombs to, Enola Gay and so forth. But it was only as soon as Nagasaki, he was ambivalent about Hiroshima. Nagasaki, he said, the term overkill was quoted.
Yeah.
It wasn't necessary. It wasn't necessary. And he became an arms control advocate. And we have had arms control advocacy since 1945. And we do have agencies, and regulatory authorities. And we all remember when Hans Blix's name was in the news as the inspector who was going around. But we also now see the destruction of alliances. The United Kingdom is a nuclear power, and it opted out of the European Union. And there are all kinds of things that change because of that, including it conforming to EU nuclear regulations. People don't talk about that. The Soviet Union was a giant nuclear power, and then it just collapsed and lost track of where all of its nuclear weapons went. Some of them went to foreign powers. Some of them are just lying around waiting to be rediscovered. Some of them will possibly go off of their own volition because the materials in their casing and the containments and whatever will break down over time. We just don't know. We have no inventory of where most of that weaponry is. So yes, 100%. I know there are all kinds of people, Donald Trump being a classic example, who don't believe in alliances, except maybe with other despots, but wants to break up one of the most powerful alliances in history, the United States and Canada, wants to get out of one of the most powerful alliances of the 20th century, NATO. So we live in a world where people with the most power are currently fighting against any even local controls, let alone international controls. And yet it is an existential priority, an existential necessity for Homo sapiens to have a planetary agreement and a planetary regulatory body that has enforcement power to deal with AI. And it has to be in place before the singularity, a term coined by a great science fiction writer, Werner Vinge, also a great professor of mathematics. But he's the guy who coined it. Ray Kurzweil took it and ran with it. Yeah. It's Kurzweil's, it's Werner's coinage. We've been warning about this singularity coming for so long. And the thing about the singularity is once it's there, it's too late to do anything. The infrastructure has to be in place beforehand. And, you can asymptotically approach the singularity. You don't ever actually have to reach it. You can get as close as you want and get all the benefits of pattern recognition AI, language processing AI. You don't have to push that final step just because we can do it. To take Michael Crichton's great science fictional line that he gave into Jeff Goldblum's mouth in the movie Jurassic Park, doesn't mean we should do it.
Right.
But we should, indeed, we must have a regulatory body that's global, not just international. Can't have opt-outs, right? This is the argument right now for the United States, no guardrails. Well, if China doesn't have any guardrails, well, why should we? Well, actually, there's a very functional Chinese government. We may not like it. And also there's a Chinese government that realistically can plan for decades ahead because they're not going to be overthrown. They have every reasonable expectation of being in power for the next 50 years. Whereas up until the most recent administration, which announced itself by saying you'll never have to vote again, we had an overturn every 4 years in the United States with a maximum of 8 years. We have routine overturns everywhere else in the developed world outside of despotic countries. So the Chinese, yes, they are doing things that we might not approve of. We're doing things that they might not approve of, but at least they are thinking decades and conceivably even centuries down the road. China has an official government policy of encouraging the reading of science fiction. They want their population to be literate in science and technology. What a contrast to the West currently. So when we say, they don't have any, they're not part of any international agreement on AI yet. We have to bring them in. We have to bring India in. We have to bring every country, because you can't have the rogue nation in this. Just as you say, nuclear weapons are all completely controlled except for North Korea. Not a damn thing you can do about that wingnut. So we just all cower in fear for the end of time. No, you have to bring even the North Koreas of the world into a ironclad agreement that we're going to regulate, control, and enforce restrictions on AI.
Hmm. When I was talking to John Dickerson on CBS recently, he said, "What are you reading lately?" And I said, "Well, I never stopped reading Thomas Hobbes because Hobbes understood the importance of
His books
having."
are nasty, brutish, and long. That's the problem with them. But yes.
I think what we need is a social contract, a world social contract, and everybody has to sign off on it, and everybody has to agree and understand. So I mentioned that as a species, we're going to have to grow up really fast. And to grow up means to understand that everybody is going to get more of what they want if they cooperate. It's the cheaters who are going to ruin it for everybody, the one bad apple or whatever. But if everybody cooperates, it's tough to get that through human minds. For some reason, we're always kind of on that defensive. We're working against our own evolutionary processes here in cognitive development. But we have to grow up super fast and understand in a Hobbesian way. We have to get very Hobbesian very quickly, which means let's draft up a world accord and have everybody sign off on it and make it punishable for those who say, no, I'm going to go it alone or I'm going to cheat. So we have great difficulty doing that in general.
Yes.
Do you think it's something we will be able to pull off in time prior to the development of an ASI type God?
The history of the last decade has dampened an awful lot of my optimism.
Yeah.
Carl Linnaeus gave us our name. Our name is Homo sapiens, which means people of wisdom. And it was the most hubristic, over the top, self congratulatory bit of self promotion in the history of the universe.
So do you think it should be
He
like
he had no demonstrable reason to believe that we were wise people. And he said, it's great marketing. Hey, I want people to adopt my binomial system. You will be given the best possible name under this system. Now, what do you think of my system, right? um, I don't think we've earned that wise in the last decade. And, when you say, okay, we need this universal declaration. And I say, okay, case study, Universal Declaration on the Rights of Man and the Citizen, Universal Declaration of Human Rights. How good have we been about adhering to that? The United States and the Conservative Party of Canada here in Canada are actively looking for opportunities to claw back rights that have been granted that Homo sapiens thought were universally acknowledged. And indeed, we do business with countries that treat women abhorrently.
Oh, yeah.
Abhorrently. And Canada, which is, we fly the rainbow flag. We have a great history of promoting women's rights in this country. And yet we continue to buy and do commerce with and even vacation in countries where women have to wear head to toe, be covered, where women can't vote, where women are considered subservient. That is abhorrent to our beliefs. And yet we say, economically, what are you going to do? It's inconvenient to stand up and fight for that. If we're not going to stand up and fight for something as simple as, women and men and anything in between on the spectrum is a person and entitled to the same rights, including the franchise. The franchise means the vote, including the franchise everywhere on this planet. Put age restrictions on it if you want. And that's the only one that we've ever come to any kind of general consensus that there's got to be an age at which you're not well informed enough or cognitively developed enough to have a coherent opinion. But after that age, nope. And we haven't gone to war for the sake of women. We haven't gone to war to prevent genital mutilation of women. No. We haven't gone to war to say women have the right to reproductive freedom. Right now in Canada, we have reproductive freedom in the United States with the overturning of Roe v. Wade, something I predicted as far back as the 1990s in my novels that it was going to be overturned by the United States. Reproductive freedom is being eroded. So on these fundamental issues that are easy to get an emotional resonance out of, we fail. Now you bring an intellectual issue and say, okay, here are machines that I can't even explain to you how they work because we don't actually know, because we can't audit what they're doing, because that's the whole point, is that these neural networks propagate forward, but back propagation, figuring out or auditing. We don't know how they do it. And well, they do these things called generative, and there's large language models, and we really need, and we're going to get a universal people lining up behind me. I sign me up for that. I will give up economic issues for that. I will boycott travel for that. I will approve of my military if need be, going in and shutting down for that. If they didn't do it for an issue that actually has resonance in the human heart, I'm not sure they're going to do it for an issue that requires ratiocination in the human intellect to come to grips with.
Right.
And that's the sad truth, but that's why we are not Homo sapiens. We are Homo, I guess this will do.
Homo dumbasses. Sometimes.
Homo dumbasses.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. I got a couple more
All right.
questions for you. We had Peter Singer on the podcast.
Practical Ethics, wonderful book. Animal Liberation. The man is, the utilitarian God. I love Peter Singer.
Yeah, I've got his book right down here somewhere. We talked about digital minds, and at what point do you think, and will there be a point, because this was one of the problems in Blade Runner, right? Was the Voight-Kampf test for determining.
Yes, which is really the Turing test, but
right.
Yes.
So how do we recognize that a point of, say, sentience or consciousness or whatever it is that we think proffers the digital mind with legal and ethical rights? How will we know when we get to that point?
So this is a very interesting issue. Descartes famously said, cogito ergo sum. That means cogito is singular. I think, ergo, therefore, sum, I am. Sum is the singular first person. Mm-hmm. He never said, we think, therefore we are. Because what he was demonstrating was the only thing I can be sure of is if I'm asking a question in my head, well, I must exist. Ask that question.
Right.
Now, are you nodding in response to me saying that because you're thinking, yeah, Rob's right. Yeah, I remember all of that. Or are you nodding because that is simply a programmed response when somebody is talking to you, and the path of least resistance is to nod periodically. And it has nothing to do with sentience. There's no empirical way for me to determine which of those two Christopher DeCarlos I'm talking to right now. The automaton that simply does those things, or the inner life one. We have no way of determining that.
Right.
So we take as a given that, all right, if it's true for me, it's probably true for everybody else.
Yeah.
That's our working assumption without any empirical test.
Internal analogy, right.
It's an analogy. But it may be that we live in a solipsistic universe. It may be that my consciousness in a vat is the only thing that exists, and everything I see around me is in fact illusion. That is quite possible. In fact, the Matrix riffs on that, of course.
It does.
Not that it's original to the Matrix. So all we have is an analogy. By analogy, I grant you sentience because I know I have it.
Right.
We don't have an empirical test. Until we have that empirical test, we're in a lot of trouble. My novel, 2 novels ago, Quantum Night, was in fact about the development of that empirical test. Suddenly we could determine whether or not a person was what my friend, the philosopher David Chalmers, calls a philosophical zombie, somebody for whom the lights are on, but nobody is home, simply goes through all of the be mindless behaviors of being a human being without a thought in their head,
right.
And somebody who actually has thoughts, and even somebody who has a conscience, which is different from a consciousness.
Yes.
Consciousness is having thoughts. Conscience is having second thoughts, is having something that interrogates your own thoughts. Wait a minute, is that a good idea, Rob? Should I be doing that? I don't know. That's conscience, which is not necessarily a locked hard concomitant of consciousness. Psychopaths have consciousness, but no conscience, for instance. Right. So we lack an empirical test. For a long time, we had a rough and ready one, the mirror test, it was called, where you would do it, for instance, with apes.
Yep.
And chimpanzees routinely pass it. Gorillas, for the most part, fail it. The test is this: when they're sleeping, just go and dab a little red makeup or whatever color you like.
Or a little yellow dot on their
eyebrow. Or a dot or something on their forehead. And then when they wake up, hand them a mirror. And chimpanzees recognize that it's them in the mirror. And so instead of reaching forward, oh, there's an ape with something on its face. He probably doesn't want that, or she reaches backwards and says, oh, there's something on my face. Whereas a gorilla reaches forward and says, oh, that poor sap there, it's got something. There's no conception, right, of himself as a separate conscious being. Obviously, there are a million arguments why that's a flawed test, but it was a test we did.
When I was at Harvard in the early 2000s.
And he drops it in, folks. That was a Harvard.
At the Stone Age lab.
Yes.
With Ofer Bar Yosef, the world's leader expert in Neanderthal.
Yeah.
You've probably read his stuff.
Oh, for sure.
I was hanging out with David Pilbeam and Richard Wrangham.
Also read Pilbeam, of course.
These were the guys who did those mirror test experiments at that time. So I kind of lived it in real time. So I'm going to slide that one.
Yeah. No, absolutely. So, but the point is, now when we talk about artificial intelligence for machines, there's a side issue, which is artificial intelligence, recognizing sentience and consciousness and rights of personhood in animals. And so there are a lot of people, and I'm a big supporter of the Great Ape Project, which was an attempt that's been going on since the 90s to get rights of personhood for the great apes.
That's right.
Who are even the most distant of the great apes, which is genetically, which is the orangutan. Yeah. The closest is the chimp or the bonobo. Both of them are equally close to us. Even though the orangutan is 98% human, we're identical. So, we just argue, well, it's unfair to say that chimps ape human behavior. They actually do cry. They actually do mourn. They actually do love. They actually do hate. And given all of that, they should be entitled at the very least to the first tier level of human rights: freedom from torture, freedom from unlawful detention, freedom from blah, blah, blah. Yeah. We're still fighting that battle. So when we come and say, okay, when do we decide when a machine gets to have a vote in a human election, or gets to be the law? Sorry, this machine is really bright. You may not shut it off unless a court finds it guilty in a jurisdiction that has capital punishment of a capital crime. Otherwise, hands off. You have no right to terminate its existence. So until we've really resolved, as Peter Singer would say, the animal liberation issues, and then we'd say, okay, what about higher primates? We go, great. It turns out that also many species of parrots and cetaceans that aren't, parrots, which aren't even mammals, right? Yeah. In fact, we used to say, well, the reason we're so much better than the dinosaurs is because the dinosaurs only have the reptilian brain. We have the mammalian part that supervenes on top of that. So what, parrots don't have that mammalian part. They're pure dinosaurian brain, and they're just fine at logic puzzles and articulating and all kinds of things. So again, we don't have in the biological realm answers to this question. And the idea that we're going to come along and say, all right, it has this many petaflops or that much gigabytes of storage, and therefore it de facto qualifies as a person, is going to be a really hard case to make to the public. I think we're going to see apes and dolphins be granted personhood before we see the first AI granted personhood. But that said, I am not a carbon chauvinist. I think what the Turing test, or the Voight-Kampff test, as they riffed on it in Blade Runner, is, what Alan Turing says, this is for the audience, I'm saying this. If you hide the person you're talking to from you, so you can't just look and see, oh, it's a machine, hide it. In Turing's example, it's just behind a screen. And you ask it questions by a medium by which you can't tell by, tone of voice or whatever, whether it's a machine or not. He said, by teletype or whatever, any questions you want. And you can't tell whether it's a human or a machine answering. Difference that makes no difference is no difference. Stamp it as human, no matter what it is on the other side of the curtain. And I think as an intellectual argument, that's one that's very easy to subscribe to. Getting the general public to say, there are 40 million human beings in Canada. And by the middle of the 21st century, let's say 150 million sentient machines, and they all get to vote. Oh, they're voting on party lines. So everything that benefits carbon and deprecates silicon is 150 million votes for and 140 million votes against. A very hard sale to make.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, through the non-sapien part of Homo sapien activities, all of the great apes are dangerously close to, threatened with extinction, dangerously close to extinction. So even if we granted every single bonobo and common chimpanzee and all species of gorilla and both species of orangutan and every species of dolphin and every species of, which are also all endangered, personhood, there'd still be more human beings outweighing them in the voting pool.
Yeah. Yeah. No, these are all very, very good points. Last question. Let's make it kind of a fun one, quasi-fun one. Given current developments in AI, if you were to write a new AI-focused novel today, not only what aspects would you approach differently based on what we now know, but would you care to team up with an AI ethicist? In this endeavor?
So the way I look at team ups here is, and I actually, once upon a time, I talked to a couple of scientists about teaming up. Said, okay, I can get 6 figures for one of my books. If you can get us to 7, you bet we're teaming up, right? Absolutely. I would be interested. That said, the job of the science fiction writer is to be an AI ethicist and a bioethicist and a nuclear ethicist and blah, 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 a gender ethicist and economic ethicist. We consult experts all the time, but we are in and of ourselves deeply immersed in this material.
Oh, of course.
And, it's when you say, and I'm not turning down the offer yet here, Chris, but I just point out, when you say, oh, Rob, when you write about AI, if you talk about teaming up with an AI expert, whereas, oh, Rob, I read your novel about interstellar exploration. I'm dumbfounded that you were able to write that without teaming up with a physicist who's an expert on, extrasolar travel technologies. Research, the word you used right at the beginning. We do it and we put it into the meat grinder, and out comes our hopefully well-considered sausage at the end. Mm-hmm. And in fact, Damon Knight, who founded the Science Fiction Fantasy Register of America, of which I used to be president, called the science fiction industry the old sausage factory.
Oh, is that right?
It's full school. It's full circle to the introduction. But so that said, I would be enormously interested in approaching the ethics of AI. And as I said in a number of my works, including Wake, Watch, and Wonder, you alluded to this when you said we don't act in our best evolutionary interest. In fact, we don't act in our species' best evolutionary interest, but we have been programmed by 3.8 billion years of biological evolution on this planet to have one imperative, which is Darwinian success. Darwinian success is preferential reproductive advantage. It literally says, if I can starve your children to death so that my children survive long enough to have children of their own, I'm a good person. Mm-hmm. I've succeeded. That's success, is starving your children to death if mine succeed because yours fail. And we carry that in our genes. Now, why do we carry that in our genes? Because that is the winnowing process that led to us being here today.
Yes.
Reproduction has always been about making more kids that are going to survive into the next generation. Whether you go back to the first, what we call Luca, the last universal common ancestor, the last thing or the earliest thing that we're all descended from, all surviving life descended from one Luca. Starting with Luca and on to the present day, it's all been about having more kids as whatever life form you are that are going to survive. And it's only in the last century that infant mortality has become negligible in developed nations. Although I point out to any American listeners that you guys are way down the list from where you should be, given where you are in terms of global economic strength. Right. Canada by far exceeds you in reduction of infant mortality. All of the European Union is ahead of you, because when you make healthcare for profit, kids die. End of editorial. The fact is that until the last century, even human beings, the lot of most women who were fertile, some of course aren't, most women who were fertile would be to have child after child after child after child until either menopause or they died during childbirth. That was the lot of women. And it was horrific and horrible. And all you have to do if you want to break your heart and cry any single day, Chris, is go to any cemetery that's more than 100 years old and look at the tombstones for children who died at 3 weeks, at 6 months, and the women who died at 22, 18, 14 in childbirth. So we're programmed. We were winnowed for 3.8 billion years to want to be nasty about reproduction. Your goal is to have as many kids as you want and invest in them as little as you can per kid, so that in aggregate, the most that they'll survive. In other words, the standard male paradigm of, hey, I just I don't how many kids I have. Well, none that I know of. Ha ha ha. Right, is reprehensible, but that's what evolution made us.
Yeah.
Right? Scatter your seed far and wide because you're being pushed forward by Richard Dawkins again, the selfish gene. So take that paradigm there. Also, I say, what is the value if Linnaeus had any insight when he called us wisdom, people of wisdom? What is the wisdom? The only wisdom we have is an ability through that conscience that I referred to reflect on what we're doing and say to myself, and it became necessary, I argue, by the way, quite strenuously in one of my books, became necessary when we started developing tools. The first tools we developed were hand axes. They're the oldest extant tools. These are weapons. They're tools for various uses, cutting trees, but also for killing things. And it used to be perfectly fine for me to disadvantage you as much as I could so that my kids would survive, until you had a spear or a bow and arrow or just a big rock that you could pick up with articulate hands and come back and exact your revenge. And then my better angels of my nature, to use the Abraham Lincoln's term from his second inaugural address that Steven Pinker made famous in his study on the decline in human violence, the better angels of my nature say, well, wait a minute. Rather than starving Chris's kids to death, why don't I lend a hand? And then Chris's kids, all right, they'll survive too. They're in the gene pool, but Chris isn't going to come and kill me for what I did to his kids. So all of that is how we ended up being intelligent. None of that applies to artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence isn't the offspring of the last universal common ancestor and 3.8 billion years of Darwinian or Hobbesian red and tooth and claw fight. It is something that comes de novo. It doesn't have that baggage. It isn't necessarily nasty, brutish, and, to correctly give the Hobbes quote, short in its lifespan. It can be altruistic. It doesn't have to be brutish at all. And in terms of, again, the Hobbes quote, nasty, brutish, and short, there's no prima facie reason that an AI should have to assume that it has a finite lifespan. Whereas every single human being, all 117 billion that have been born since the dawn of Homo sapiens, has had very good reason to believe that their lifespan is finite. Every single person who's tried to cheat death so far has failed. Maybe the transhumanists will succeed, but they haven't yet. So we're nasty, brutish, and short. AI doesn't have to be. And I still go back to what I wrote, Wake, Watch, and Wonder, given that there just doesn't seem to be any damn way to convince the AI people that just because we can do it doesn't mean we have to do it. Given that they're going to do it, they're hell-bent on doing it, then my interest in this space of discourse, is in finding that game theoretical win-win solution. All of evolution is about win-lose. There's nothing in our genes that is geared towards finding, the game theoretical solution that is win-win for both sides. That may be possible with AI, but it will require very, very careful planning on our part, guardrails on our part, and, we have to be honest, an enormous amount of luck on our part too.
I am certainly in agreement with you there, sir, and I wish our species wisdom and luck, moving forward in that regard. Listen, I want to thank you for being on the podcast today. It's been a pleasure talking to you. I've got, about a million more questions for you, but I think that'll have to be
Put me on your
Rob's.
committee and we can hash them out
We'll have a
on my
Rob Sawyer
committee.
2.0. We'll get you back on in the next little while, and we'll
I'd
talk
love that.
about a lot more topics that are developing, AI related and others. But man, it was great talking to you today.
My pleasure, Chris.
I look
As we
forward to
say in the
seeing.
science fiction game, live long and prosper.